The Read to Lead Podcast, episode 71.
Hi, I'm Jared Easley, author of Podcasting Good to Great, How to Grow Your Audience Through Collaboration. And you're about to enjoy one of my favorite podcasts. It's the Read to Lead Podcast with my friend, Jeff Brown.
It's going to happen in our lifetime where you won't just master one craft and do that for the rest of your life. You're going to have to take a bunch of different skills and combine them in a unique way that is your portfolio, and that, I argue, is actually your calling.
Welcome to the Read to Lead podcast with Jeff Brown. Jeff believes that if you desire to achieve true success in business and in life, then consistent and intentional reading is a must. The Read to Lead podcast will not only help you narrow this ever-important reading list, but also bring you key insights and valuable feedback from some of today's most successful and inspiring authors. And now, here's Jeff.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast dedicated to your personal and professional growth, where we sit down with a successful and inspiring author each and every week, and we talk about their latest book and their insights on things like leadership, personal development, career, marketing, and entrepreneurship. And in today's episode, we'll be chatting with Jeff Goins, best-selling author of The Art of Work, a proven path to discovering what you were meant to do. And I'll ask Jeff about the concept of succeeding not despite our failures, but because of them, the importance of mindset and what Jeff learned from his dad about doing your best, the portfolio life and why the future belongs to those willing to embrace it, and a lot more. Jeff mentioned to me the other day he wanted to do something especially for listeners to this show. So stick around for the end of today's conversation. We'll have more details about that. It involves putting you in the interviewer seat and letting you ask Jeff the questions. Again, more information about that at the conclusion of today's conversation. Jeff will also have information on how you can get his book plus several $100s in extras for just the cost of shipping the book alone, about $7. Be sure and stick around to the end of the show for more details. I want to remind you of the folks making this podcast possible. First is Blinkist, where they serve up inside their free app fantastic business book summaries in both written and in audio form. To try the app free for 3 days and determine if it's right for you, just go to readtoleadpodcast.com/Blinkist, Blinkist. And also our friends at lynda.com, who want to offer you a 10-day free trial, access to every one of the thousands of tutorials on their site just for listening to this show. To find out more, readtoleadpodcast.com/Lynda, Lynda. Jeff Goins is a full-time writer and lives just outside Nashville, Tennessee. His website, goinswriter.com, has been visited by more than 4 million people from all over the world. He has authored 3 previous books, The In-Between, Wrecked, and You Are a Writer. And his latest book is called The Art of Work, a proven path to discovering what you were meant to do. If you missed our first conversation with Jeff centered around his last book, The In-Between, you can check out readtoleadpodcast.com/004 for episode 4. Well, in the new book, Art of Work, after encountering hundreds of stories from people who found their calling, Jeff has identified 7 common characteristics, and he dedicates a chapter to each one of these: awareness, apprenticeship, practice, discovery, profession, mastery, and legacy. And I want to start off, Jeff, by commending you for not falling to the temptation of trying to cram these into some cheesy acronym.
Yeah. Well, thanks. You know, I'm so skeptical of things that sound easy or, you know, like I get the need to make things digestible and memorable, but this is not an easy process, and I think we do the concept of a calling a disservice when we say, "Oh, it's easy. It's 7 easy steps." So even the fact of like separating them into these 7 core principles was something that I really evaded, but then just realized, no, this is really the way I think it works. But yeah, thanks. I don't really like acronyms.
Well, I want to start by making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to calling, and you describe it in the introduction of the book as not some carefully crafted plan, but what's left when the plan goes horribly wrong. So elaborate on that for us, if you would.
Sure. Well, I think that there are books about how to succeed at anything There are books about how to become master of your own destiny. And I think those things are fine. This just isn't one of those books. This is a book for the rest of us who feel like we don't really just know what we want to do with our lives. And if we have some notion of what that might look like, it feels kind of messy. Like we feel like we're having to kind of pick up the pieces of our lives and make some sense of it. And I think most of us feel like at times life is something that happens to us, regardless of how many, positive thinking books we read and how many seminars we go to. At times there seem to be things that happen that are outside of our control. And I think any of us who are honest about our lives would admit that. And so The Art of Work, the basic premise, and I talk about this in the introduction of the book, which sort of sets the stage for it, is that maybe the life that you lead and finding your life's purpose isn't so much about saying, here's what I want to go do with my life, but rather, here's what I'm learning about myself from my life. And, things happen to us, good things, bad things happen to us. But maybe a remarkable life isn't so much about controlling the things that happen to us, but rather controlling our reactions to them.
And early in the book, I think it's in chapter 1, there's this discussion about good fear versus bad fear. And you say the trick is to know when to listen to your fear and when to not. And so how can we be sure when it comes to that, Jeff, that we're making the right decision?
So, I think that there's a lot of talk about fear in the world today, Jeff, and you and I listen to a lot of podcasts talking about, motivation and how do you go do the thing that you're supposed to do, whatever that might be. How do you chase a dream? How do you succeed? And I think that we have downplayed the positive importance of fear in our lives. And in the book, I talk about a woman, Jody Noland, who really used fear to find her life's work. And she found it, later on in her life. She found it in her late 50s. She found this thing that she was supposed to do, which was start an organization helping people write letters of legacy to their loved ones. And she came upon this work by going through a season of pain, of seeing friends and loved ones and ultimately her husband die, many of which died of cancer, and seeing the dramatic difference between somebody who wrote a love letter to their kids or their spouse and said, just letting them know how they felt about them. And she saw the difference that made on people. And then she saw the void it left when somebody moved on, passed, and, a son or a daughter or a friend or a spouse had some sort of void in their life, and they were unsure of how that person felt about them. And so Jody's fear was that she told me this. She said when she finally realized that she was the person that was going to have to do this, because she saw one of her friends write a letter to his daughters on his deathbed, and it changed their lives. And then she saw the opposite happen with her husband. And when she realized that she was the person that was going to have to do this, she kept talking to friends saying, hey, shouldn't somebody do this? This is a great idea, to teach people how to write letters to, their loved ones before they go. People say, yeah, that's a great idea. But she realized pretty quickly, I'm the one. I'm the one that has to do it. She told me I was no longer afraid of failing at the point that I knew that I was supposed to do. I was afraid of not trying. So good fear is about good fear leads to action. Bad fear leads to inaction. Bad fear leads to shame and inadequacy, and you just I can't do this. I'm not good enough. That's bad fear. If I'm afraid of messing up or failing, and that just leads to me not trying, that's a bad kind of fear. A good kind of fear is the fear of missed opportunities, fearing living a life that ultimately doesn't matter. That kind of fear, as it did for Jody Noland, can propel you into, I think, a more powerful, impactful future that leaves a life of legacy.
Well, if you know much about Jeff and his accomplishments these last few years, it might be kind of difficult to believe that he once had no idea what he was meant to do and what his dream was. So, Jeff, what is your response to somebody who finds themselves in that same place today?
So I think that there is this myth that we all know what we're supposed to do with our lives, that we just know. And if you don't just know, you're kind of out of luck. You're not special. You're not elite, and good luck. You're just kind of doomed to live a nominal, boring existence. But I think the truth is that most of us don't know. Maybe some people, maybe some very special people. I want to leave this allowance that some people are born and they just know what they're supposed to do. But I think it's a very cruel taunt for me to, tell you and tell all of these listeners that you just know what you're supposed to do. You just got to dig deep down into your soul, because a lot of us feel lost. I sometimes still go, gosh, what am I supposed to do? So if you have to just know, if that's a prerequisite to finding your life's work, that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow, I think. But as I found through talking to hundreds of people, re-examining my own story, not just the sanitized story that I like to tell people, where it's all like glitter and fairies and rainbows, but like the difficulty of I did this and I wasn't quite sure and I thought I might fail, and then I did this and I also wasn't sure. When I got really honest about my story, I realized I didn't ever just know. To quote Mother Teresa, I didn't have clarity. What I did have was trust. And so I think that this path to finding your life's work is a path that has to be marked by trust. You have to take intentional action, move forward in a direction. You're not just wandering around, like a lot of people just, lost trying to figure life out. You're moving in a direction, but you don't know. You don't have clarity. I say in the book that clarity comes with action. Discovery comes as you begin to act on what you do know. So if you don't feel like you know what you're supposed to do with your life, I think you're in the majority, not the minority. And amongst the people in the book, full of stories of incredible lives of impact, people like Mother Teresa, Walt Disney, also a cast of characters of new people that I'm introducing you to, everyday people living these extraordinary lives. If you don't know, much as they didn't know, you're in good company.
Well, the second characteristic is what you label as apprenticeship. And the question that is often asked, and I've been guilty of this too, is how do I find a mentor? And you say that's not the question we should be asking. Yeah,
I think it's really hard to find a mentor. I mean, have you ever tried to get somebody to mentor you and they turned you down or, avoided your phone calls? I have. It's awkward. It's hard, to get somebody to say yes to potentially a lifetime of investing in your life. That feels a bit much, especially in a pretty, segmented, fractured culture, highly individualistic. I'm talking about, being in the U.S. or even, in much of the Western world, very individualistic culture. Contrast that with, other societies. I mean, this isn't, like this in all parts of the world, but in kind of post-industrial societies, it's certainly this way. People kind of live these solitary lives where you go to work, drive home, pull into a garage, don't see your neighbor, like it's pretty individualistic. It's hard to engage with somebody at that intimate of a level where you're asking them to mentor you. So I don't think you should go ask somebody to be a mentor. I think that's the worst way to find a mentor. It can work. It's a way, but I think it's one of the worst ways to find a mentor. The best way to find a mentor is to recognize the one that's already there. And so I argue that we have mentors all around us all the time. We just need eyes to see them.
Jeff, you make such a great point about the mentor being somebody who could be right under your nose. Optimally, that person is someone who is sharing a physical space with you, someone who is present physically, helping mentor you. But sometimes that can be a podcast or that can be a book you've read. And I consider Dan Miller a mentor to me, even though I've never met with Dan for the purpose of being mentored by him. His podcast and his books have mentored me over the years. And I think, too, about folks like our sponsor at lynda.com. They've impacted millions of people around the world with their thousands of courses and their hundreds of thousands of video on things like web development and photography, visual design, business, and even software training like Excel and WordPress and Photoshop and that kind of stuff. So if that's stuff you want to learn about and you want to be mentored by somebody, that person doesn't necessarily have to be in your neck of the woods. That mentor could very well be somebody halfway around the world, but brought to you by the magic of the internet. And by the way, Lynda is offering for Read to Lead podcast listeners right now a free 10-day trial where you get access to every video on their site absolutely free for 10 days. If you want to take advantage of that, just go to readtoleadpodcast.com/Lynda. That's readtoleadpodcast.com/Lynda, Lynda. Jeff, share a bit about the importance of mindset and what you learned from your father when it comes to doing your best.
So my dad always told me to try try my best, as I'm sure a lot of parents do and have done. And I was a pretty good student. I would bring my report card home to my dad, and for many years in my life, I got straight A's. And then every once in a while, I'd get a B or something, and he'd look at that, and he wouldn't frown or look disappointed. He would go, "Jeff, did you try your best?" And there were times, because I never wanted to lie to my dad. I don't know what this was about. I learned how to do that eventually. It was an acquired skill. No, but I mean, when my dad would ask me in elementary school and middle school, "Did you try your best?" And sometimes those were straight A's on the report card. And I'd go, I don't need to try my best. It was easy. And he would go, "No, that's not okay. I'm not." I'm kind of disappointed, if you didn't try your best, even if you did great. And then the contrast was, say I got a C or something on my report card, and that wasn't a typical grade for me. And he, goes, "Well, did you try your best?" I go, "Dad, I tried really hard. Like I do not get chemistry." And he would go, "Great, I'm really proud of you." So that was really good. That was a really good lesson for me to learn. But the lesson I extrapolated from that, which was a bad lesson, and then sort of how I redeemed it and learned, about what he was really getting to. I'll explain in a minute. But what I learned from that is, if I just say I did my best, if I say I tried, then I'm fine. And I went through much of my life saying, "Oh, I tried and it didn't work," not really understanding the importance of practice. I call it painful practice in the book. And so you're not just supposed to find your calling, I argue. You're supposed to become really great at it. And doing your best means two things. One, it means always pushing yourself to the extent of your abilities and then pushing a little bit further, because we're actually capable of more than we realize. And so if I just go, "I tried my best," and I'm basically phoning it in, that's not good enough. And that's what my dad was teaching me when I got straight A's and I wasn't trying my best. He goes, "That's not good enough. You got to keep pushing yourself." Not because he was a slave driver, not because he expected perfection, but because he had this idea of what Carol Dweck calls the growth mindset. And the contrast to that is the fixed mindset. The growth mindset is always growing. You're always trying to do something, better than you did before. The fixed mindset is, this belief that we're sort of born with, this set of abilities and it just kind of is what it is. But we can always keep growing. And, so the lesson that we learn from practice is we've got to keep pushing ourselves. And then, the other thing that we have to learn is I can't compare myself to somebody else's version of success. It's my best. It's not your best. It's not, Michael Jordan's best. It's my best. And if I'm continually pushing myself, continuing to do better and be better than I was the day before, then I'm embracing that growth mindset, which happens to be, according to Carol Dweck, one of the secrets to happiness and one of the secrets to living a very miserable existence is to have this fixed mindset where you just sort of settle and worry about anybody passing you and you just kind of stay stuck in your current level of ability.
So when you can do something when it's not fun or when you're bored with it or you want to give up, then you just might have found your calling. Is that ultimately what you're saying?
Yeah. So, I mean, I call it the crucible of painful practice. I think there's this fear that if you do something too much, like, for example, with me, it was playing music. I was a guitar player for many years, and I still play guitar. But for a season, I thought, this is going to be my life. This is going to be my vocation. And I did it again and again and again, and I got really good at it. I got much better than I ever thought possible at it. And I started to burn out. And what I realized isn't that if you pursue a passion or you push it too much that ultimately it becomes not fun anymore. I realized that hobbies don't necessarily equate to vocations. And so the best way that you can find your vocation is to put it through this difficult, painful process of practicing to the point where you're pushing yourself to your utter limits. And if that is a life-giving, exciting process, and you can get up and do it again and again and again, it just might be your calling. And if it's not the end of the world. That's just a hobby. But I realized when I pushed myself with music, it burnt me out. When I pushed myself with writing, it got me more and more excited to grow. And I think practice isn't the thing that you do once you figure out what your calling is. Practice is the thing that you do to discover what your calling is. Even
if you can do the hard thing of serenading a girl and asking her to a dance, it might not be your calling, right?
That's right. Yeah, which I have some experience with.
I'd love for you to expound on Jeff, your belief that we don't succeed despite our failures, but because of them.
So I want us to rethink the way we treat failure. I think that we think of failure as a sign that we did something wrong. And certainly, there can be some of that in that. But I think failure is like, don't try that again. And if we fail enough, we just want to give up. But what if failure was one of the best teachers that we had in this process of finding our dream, discovering our life's work, and leading a life of impact? And I have good reason to believe it is. I mean, one of the interesting things that I've learned in reading tons of biographies, Jeff, I know that you love to read. I've gotten really into biography over the past few years because it's one thing to read the 7 secrets to this or 12 principles for that. It's another thing to read somebody's story and go, what did they do in this moment? And you can read, the stories of Albert Einstein and Benjamin Franklin and Mother Teresa and people who have led incredible lives of impact. Walt Disney was another one. And they all have this common attribute. And it's not that they failed once, but that they, in fact, had a season of failure. And often that season in life lasts as long as 10 years. Incidentally, that was the in the Renaissance era, late Middle Ages period. That was the average length of an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship lasted 7 years. Then you went out as a journeyman, which usually lasted 2 or 3 years, and then you became a master, usually within the course of about 10 years. And so if we look at failure as this like sign that we're doing something wrong, then we misinterpret its message. But if we look at failure as the necessary course that we have to go through, the apprenticeship that's going to qualify us to do our life's work, then we have a different way of thinking about it. And so I suggest that failure is kind of like what happens in basketball when you're dribbling the ball down the court and then you stop. Right, and you kind of run out of options because if you keep running without dribbling, or stop and then dribble again, you're going to travel and you're going to lose the ball. But you have a final move left when you're dribbling down the court in basketball. After you've taken your final couple of steps, you have what's called a pivot, where you can leave one foot planted and you can basically circle 360 degrees. You can move in any direction. You're planted in one place. So, I mean, you have limited options, but at the same time, within those limitations, you can, you have full range of motion and you can kind of pivot and turn in a different direction, pass the ball, shoot, whatever you can do in that place. And I think we need to stop thinking of failure as failure and start thinking of it as a pivot point. In other words, when it seems like we are out of all other options, everything is exhausted, we still have room to pivot, which means that when we run into an obstacle, it looks like there's no way to overcome it. Maybe the right thing to do is just tweak the direction a little bit and then start moving again.
I have to admit that before reading this book, I thought Jeff Goins and sports analogies were mutually exclusive, but that's not necessarily the case.
That's mostly the case, Jeff. I was like Googling things to make sure because I was like, I like basketball. It's one of the sports that I really enjoy, and I played when I was a kid. But I was like, if I get this wrong, there's gonna be trouble.
Well, when you first launched your podcast, The Portfolio Life, I was really intrigued by this term I felt you had coined to describe this new world of work that we're experiencing. And you say in the book, the future belongs to those willing to embrace this new kind of mastery. So what does the portfolio life look like?
So the portfolio life is a term that I borrowed from a guy named Charles Handy, who wrote this really interesting book called The Age of Unreason. He's a British guy, and it's a business book from 1989, I believe. And it's really a book about the future of organizations. Really easy to read. I mean, akin to like a Seth Godin book. Very readable, very interesting. But basically, he's predicting the future of organizations, companies, nonprofit organizations, the world of work as we know it. And this is in 1989. And he says, in the future, people are going to have portfolios for careers. What he means by that is that instead of working one job for 40 years, retiring, getting a pension, and just living out, the final remaining years of your life. And if you think, kind of early 20th century, once you retired, you didn't have much life left to live. Typically, the age expectancy was lower, and you'd usually worked yourself to the bone in that factory and worn yourself down. So he says that this doesn't work anymore. organizations are getting smaller, not bigger. People are outsourcing more. And he said in the future, most people are going to have portfolio careers, portfolio lives. And he said we should be preparing for that future now. Now, what's really interesting is recently Forbes published a study. They didn't, conduct the study. Lots of people were talking about it, but Forbes popularized this study that basically predicted that by the year 2030, over half of the working force will be independent contractors. They'll be freelancers. In other words, they will have portfolio careers. They won't have one gig. They'll have a bunch of gigs. And so the future is coming, and it's going to happen in our lifetime where you won't just have one thing. You won't just master one craft and do that for the rest of your life. You're going to have to take a bunch of different skills and combine them in a unique way that is your portfolio. And that, I argue, is actually your calling.
Well, I know you used to believe, you say in the book, that pursuing a dream was all about the person doing the pursuing, that it was inherently selfish, I think is the phrase you use. What have you learned since, and what has your journey taught you about what it means to leave a legacy?
I think a dream feels inherently selfish. I mean, it's something personal, it's private, it's something that you're usually hesitant to share with somebody else because you're afraid of failure or rejection. You don't want to get shut down. And yet what I've learned is that when you start sharing your dream with the world, you realize how much bigger it is than you. I think that we're caretakers of our dreams. We're not owners. To be kind of nerdy, I think of, in The Lord of the Rings, the steward of Gondor, right? There's this, character who's the steward of Gondor, and Gondor is the kingdom of men. And he, steward is this old, medieval word, but it basically means you're in charge of taking care of this land, but you don't own it. The king owns this, and you're just a steward of it. And so, in the Return of the King and Lord of the Rings, the king comes back, and he takes his rightful place on the throne. And, the expectation is that, the steward has to step down. And I'm not going to go into, a 1,000-page book and the plot, but there's a lot wrapped up in that. But that's what I think is true of our dreams, the things that we feel like are our calling, like we feel like it's it belongs to us, and it doesn't belong to you. You're a steward of that. You're a caretaker of it, and in some ways, it belongs to the people that it's going to impact. And to paraphrase Jackie Robinson, he says that a life is not significant except for the impact it has on others. And I found that a calling is the vehicle that gets you to that life of impact.
Well, before I move on to some questions not directly related to the book, Jeff, is there anything else from the book you want to make sure we know about?
I just, I wrote this book because it bothered me that people weren't talking about this. And when people that write books anyway, that have, agendas to push sometimes and, things to sell, I spent years researching this topic. I lived it. And then I, went out and interviewed real people who had gone through this experience, and I found that the norm isn't that you just know. It's not just one thing. And it's not something that just belongs to you. It is a calling, is something that you discover as you take intentional action in your life. It's something that grows. As you do, it continues to evolve. It's many things. It's your whole life. I think, not just like something that you do when you're 35 and then just coast for the rest of your life. It's all gravy. It is the life that you live. And what I learned is it's not just about doing something, it's about becoming someone, the person that you're meant to be. And I don't ever write books just to write them because it makes me look good, because I look pretty good as it is. Just kidding. But I write books, I write anything because I feel like this has to be written. And I mentioned this in the author's note. I didn't write the book, like this wasn't the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book where I was like, I was the guru and I'm going to tell you all these cool things. But as I kind of got into the process of writing it, I realized that this was the book that wanted to be written. And I think the final product of it for me was realizing, wow, this process really surprised me. I set out to do one thing and I ended up doing something else. Finding your calling is a process that will surprise you. And, the point of this book, The Art of Work, is just to give you some signposts to recognize, along the path to that destination.
Well, I know you've really gotten into biographies here since we last talked and sat down to do this. So I'd be curious to know if you could name for us, Jeff, a couple of books that you have read during that time or maybe are currently reading that have impacted you, and maybe share how or why they impacted you as they have.
Sure. I read several books, in just for fun, and also they ended up contributing to the research for this book. Probably one of my favorite books that I read in the past year was called Walt Disney. There's a lot of biographies about Walt Disney. I've read a couple, but I think probably the best one I've read so far has been Walt Disney by Neil Gabler, Nealgabler. I listened to it on Audible. I know you're a fan of audiobooks. And it was really great. Some audiobooks are kind of scratchy and not great, audio quality. This was a great audiobook. I read that. Bonhoeffer by Eric Metaxas. That was a great book. Kind of about your calling, maybe the thing that actually gets you killed in his case. And there's a story that I mentioned in the book about pivot points where Bonhoeffer actually pivoted away from comfort in the direction of a decision that would ultimately lead to his death, where he was opposing Hitler and then he would be killed for that. But he knew when he made that decision that he was likely going to his death. He left Germany, moved to the U.S., and then turned around and went back because it offended his conscience. And I think we need to read more stories about sometimes pursuing your life's work is going to leave a legacy, but it's not going to make you look great. It's not going to lead to your own personal comfort all the time. It can be really difficult. And then lastly, there's so many great biographies, but another one that I really enjoyed was, and it's a long one, was Titan, which is the story of John D. Rockefeller. That is an incredible book. It's a 1,000-page book, so I don't recommend it lightly because it's going to take some time to get through. But the world's richest man, who was also one of the world's biggest philanthropists, kind of a polemical figure. They basically wrote the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is about monopolies. Based on his business practices, because those laws did not exist. And, but it's just interesting. We have inherited, at least in the U.S., we've inherited a culture that he, impacted, and we see, the fruit of that influence even today. Anyway, it's a fascinating book. But out of all those, if I could pick one, I'd pick that Walt Disney book. It was great.
Well, I know you would agree that being able to effectively share your ideas in public can play a major role in your ability to succeed. And so I'd be curious to know, as somebody who does a fair amount of public speaking, what are some tips you would have for delivering a meaningful and memorable public talk?
So one of the best things I ever did was invest in my public speaking, meaning I went to a public speaking conference, not once, not twice, but 3 times, a conference called the SCORE Conference. SCORE is spelled with 2 R's, and that is an acronym for a method that I use for speech preparation. It's something that I learned from Ken Davis. Michael Hyatt has used it as well. I've talked to many people who are public speakers that, before were pretty good, and then they go through that and they are great. But I think, the lesson there is have a system. Don't just get up and talk. Have a system, some method for preparing the speech so that when people are listening to it, they have some sense of where this is leading. And recently I saw 2 public speakers, one who had a lot of emotion, a lot of stories, was entertaining to listen to, but I didn't really know, what the outcome was. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I had no idea when the speech was going to end. There was no sense of momentum. It was a lot of stuff, and it's hard to focus on that mentally when I don't know where you're going, I don't know where you've been, and I can't remember what you said. And then contrasted that with another speaker I saw who was, it wasn't super polished, but had 3 main points. And he didn't say point 1, point 2, point 3. It was just obvious that there was a structure, beginning, middle, and end, had some interesting anecdotes to support those points, and then some memorable takeaways. And I was like, wow, this was excellent. I had notes. I knew exactly what I was supposed to go do after listening to this speech. And I think that's something that people don't realize. I didn't realize this. I thought you just kind of stand up and talk. And, I think you have to have a structure, a means of organizing the talk. And when you're delivering it, you need to let people know where you're going. But there also needs to be tension. So, the age-old advice, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've told them, that's bad advice. Because if you tell them what you're going to tell them, now they know and they can leave. The better way to do it is to say, I'm going to tell you 3 things. Here's thing 1. Here's thing 2. Here's thing 3. Now we're done. So that there's suspense, there's anticipation of what's to come. So organization and suspense, I think those 2 things together will create a very memorable talk.
You mentioned Ken Davis. I'll put a link to our interview with him in the show notes from episode 16. I loved his book, Secrets of Dynamic Communication. I know at the time that we're publishing this conversation, you've got a special promotion going on leading up to the actual release of the book, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to share a bit of the details about that.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. This is a book that I'm really excited about, and I made the decision that when I was writing this, that I was going to do everything I could to get this book into as many hands as possible. And because I am a full-time writer, but I also, have side businesses and I do other things, partly because I thought when I started writing, there was no way that I'd be able to make a full-time living doing it. Because of that, it gives me the freedom to, do risky things to get more books into people's hands without, it costing me, the opportunity of keeping the lights on at my house. So for this book, we're doing something really risky, and I'm only offering this to my readers and then to, friends of mine who have, audiences as you do, Jeff. This isn't, some mass publicity thing that we're doing. But basically what we've done is we have a limited number of books that we're giving away for free. All you have to do is pay shipping and handling to, get the book to your doorstep, and I'm giving the book to you for free. But there's a limited time that we're doing that. That's between now and March 23rd will be the last day to do it. The book publishes on March 24th. If you do that, you're going to get the book when it comes out like everybody else. But if you do that now, you'll get a free digital download to start reading the book now. And then there's a bunch of bonuses, including a free online course, a video course where I talk through these 4 different mindset shifts that you have to go through in order to begin to find your calling. There's a downloadable workbook. There's over $250 worth of bonuses with a free book. All you have to do is, pay the shipping and handling. So I'm excited about this. I mean, I've had several friends go, why in the world are you doing this? Well, because I believe in this message. I want to get it into people's hands. And I think if we get it into people's hands, it'll get people talking, which will allow, more books to reach more people.
Well, Jeff, I've always been really appreciative of you and your work, especially going back to the beginning of this podcast journey. You were one of those who agreed to an interview before the podcast had even launched and helped us get started. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for coming back and sharing with us about the art of work. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I forgot to mention where to get that free book. That's at artofworkbook.com, artofworkbook.com. And there's a video that'll talk you through all of that. And like I said, there's a limited number of books, and this is for a limited time. And that's not just something I'm saying to go get you to do it. I just don't want you to, miss that opportunity. But thanks again, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
Well, as I hinted at the beginning of the show, Jeff expressed a desire to do something just for listeners of the Read to Lead podcast. So we're going to do a bonus episode that will publish in early to mid-March. And this time, instead of me initiating the questions are going to come directly from you. And here's how you can submit a question for Jeff that could indeed air in our bonus episode together. Just go to readtoleadpodcast.com/question, and there you'll have a chance from your mobile device or from your desktop to press a record button and leave a voicemail version of your question. Now, before you think to yourself, oh my gosh, the pressure's on, I've got to get it right the first time. No, that's not necessarily the case. If you mess up your message the first time, you can stop and re-record your message, so no pressure at all. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to start off your message by introducing yourself, saying hello and your name, and tell us, if you want to, your website address, and then follow that with your question. Now, if we use your question on the bonus episode, your name is going to go into a drawing for 3 surprise books that I'll be giving away. Not 1, not 2, but 3 different books from previous guests here on the Read to Lead podcast. Again, the way to submit your question for the bonus episode with Jeff, readtoleadpodcast.com/question. Our new Facebook group is rapidly growing, and we would love to have you there. A lot of interaction happening, a lot of great discussion, too. To be added to the Facebook group, just go to readtoleadpodcast.com/group. A couple of great podcasts I encourage you to check out. My friend Brendan Hufford is hosting Entrepreneurs and Coffee. It launched a little over a month ago and is doing very, very well. eandcoffee.com. And there's the brand new podcast launching just this week from my friend Eric Scabaris. It's the Mentor Me podcast, found at mentormepodcast.com. Well, I'm so glad you've made it through another episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time for the Read to Lead podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to the Read to Lead podcast. As a subscriber, we challenge you to be more than just a passive listener. Become a vital member of the community. Visit us on the web at readtoleadpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, leaders read and readers lead.
Some folks like to get away, take a holiday from the neighborhood. Hop a flight to Miami Beach or to Hollywood. But I'm taking a Greyhound on the Hudson River line. I'm in a New York state of mind.